One of the last great mysteries of the 20th century began on September 17th, 1961, just outside the borders of the Congo, when a plane carrying the second UN Secretary-General, Dag Hammarskjöld, and 15 others crashed. Hammarskjöld was flying in to try and mediate the end of a civil war which had racked the Congo for years and was based on its black citizens deciding they wanted to rule themselves. In a sense, this story starts in the late 19th century when King Leopold, the King of Belgium, decided he had to have a colony. And by fair means and foul, he grabbed hold of the Congo. And what followed was, 20 or 30 years of the most brutal imaginable regime. One estimate suggests that between 8 and 10 million Congolese, which is half the population, died of sickness, of exhaustion, through plain murder in that period. And what followed it was kind of a form of apartheid for several decades. And then in January 1959, the black Congolese population simply had had enough. They wanted to rule themselves. They'd had enough of being told what to do. What followed was days or even weeks of violence. Many of the white Congolese and white European residents fled to the most mineral-rich region of the Congo, which is called Katanga. And they immediately seceded with the backing of Belgium, and they formed their own state, which was immediately at civil war with the rest of the Congo. And it gets even more complicated because this was the height of the Cold War. And the Congo was absolutely key for both uranium, which of course is used for nuclear weapons, and for cobalt, which was used for missiles to deliver those nuclear weapons. And it was also seen as strategically key. And so Britain and America and Russia, and in fact every nation with a stake in the Cold War, had spies there, they had their own interests there, they were watching what was happening. Hammarskjöld was appointed to the UN Secretary-Generalship in part because he seemed not threatening. He was an aristocrat, he was seen as a bureaucrat, he was trained as an economist. He didn't really have much of a history of rebellion, but he was on fire with principle. He was someone who was really an idealist, who was in his soul kind of an artist. And he really wanted to do good, and he was willing to sacrifice and to stand up for his principles.
It is very easy to bow to the wish of a big power. It is another matter to resist.
Hammarskjöld decided that the only principled course of action was to stand up for the black Congolese's right to rule themselves. He felt like they shouldn't be victims of another global power, that they had to form their own government for good or ill. And taking this position, which of course now seems like common sense or basic principle, put him at odds with nearly everyone. And so he decided to fly from New York to the Congo to try and resolve the situation once and for all. He planned to meet with the leader of Katanga and thresh out a peace that could hopefully begin to reunite the nation. On that night, he was facing all sorts of dangers that he could not possibly have anticipated, many of which we've only learned about very recently. There were thickets of spies, there were white supremacist mercenaries, there was a hostile government in the government of Rhodesia and Nyasaland just across the border. He was, in some senses, beset upon all sides. Hammarskjöld understood in some sense that he was really in danger, so they had flown as stealthily as they could. No one knew exactly where they were going. They filed a false flight plan. They made contact with the control tower, as usual, and then planned to circle around and come back, and they just disappeared.
A lone UN banner flies at half-staff as saddened colleagues gather at a news conference to make the official announcement of the Secretary-General's death in the wilds of Central Africa. He was en route to peace talks with Katanga President Moise Tshombe when he perished in the crash of the plane flying him from Leopoldville, the Congo, to Angola, North Korea.
The official investigation ruled that it was an accident, but even at the time, there were all these strange, mysterious occurrences or unexplained events. An ace of spades playing card was placed on Hammarskjöld's body, and no one quite knows why it ended up there. One of those aboard survived the crash for some hours before succumbing to his injuries, and he spoke of an explosion. Some of the witnesses saw another plane in the sky, and those conclusions were just brushed under the carpet. They were sort of dismissed. The witnesses who brought them up were dismissed as untrustworthy. The guy who subsequently died, his testimony was cast into doubt because it was said he was delirious. The day after he died, Harry Truman, completely unprompted, told reporters that he felt Hammarskjöld had been killed. In fact, he made a point of going back and repeating that he felt he'd been killed. But he didn't specify exactly what he meant by that, which is fascinating because he was a confidant of Kennedy, and it's quite plausible that he knew something that the rest of us didn't know. There were a whole bunch of people who never believed the official verdict. They kept on digging. They were friends of Hammarskjöld's, they were associates, they were journalists, historians, and they came up with some eyebrow-raising stuff. There was a plausible story from a Belgian pilot that he'd been involved in a mission to divert Hammarskjöld's plane, and it had gone wrong and the plane crashed. There was a story from some French white supremacist mercenaries who suggested they had tried to hijack the plane. The hijacking had gone wrong and the plane crashed. And a couple of NSA operatives came forward later in their lives when they were long retired and said they'd been eavesdropping on the conflict and they had heard some things on the radio which made them feel that this was no accident. One of the only ways we can maybe know for sure is if the British and American governments open up their archives and show us what they have on the events of September 17th and 18th, 1961 in Katanga. I'm pushing for that, the UN is pushing for that, but they don't show many signs of giving in. Hammarskjöld's something of a forgotten figure now, but shortly after he died, John F. Kennedy called him the greatest statesman of the 20th century.
Dag Hammarskjöld is dead, but the United Nations lives. A noble servant of peace is gone, but the quest for peace lies before us.
The UN is 75 this year, and I can't help but notice that it confronts a world that's very similar to the one that Hammarskjöld confronted. It's chaos, it's conflict, it's mistrust. But it also confronts a lot of issues that simply can't be solved by one nation by itself. You have pandemics, you have disinformation, you have climate change, the list goes on. And I, for one, hope that it can start to interpret its role in a more Hammarskjöldian way, that the Secretary-General can start to see himself as someone who guides nations, as Hammarskjöld said, toward a better version of themselves.